My name is Cassandra Whitfield, and I was 31 years old the afternoon my father sat across from me at our kitchen table, folded his hands the way he does when he's already decided something, and told me the Harringtons had asked if I could skip my sister's reception. Not skip the wedding. The reception. The part one had spent 14 months organizing and $47,000 making possible. He said it quietly. Your energy puts people off, Cass. The Harringtons asked specifically. It's just one evening. You understand. I looked at him for a moment. Then I said, Sure, Dad. I understand. I did understand. I understood completely. What he didn't know, what none of them had stopped to think about in all the planning and the centerpiece arguments and the tasting menus and the late-night phone calls I fielded alone, was that every vendor agreement, every deposit confirmation, every contract for that ballroom, that catering team, that lighting rig, every single one of them had one name at the top. Mine. I sent one email that night. Polite. Professional. 3 sentences. What happened at that venue entrance the following Saturday, in front of both families and 112 guests, is something I think about whenever anyone tells me quiet people don't fight back. Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where quiet people hold the receipts and let the paperwork do the talking. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. And if you've ever been the one who handled everything and got thanked with nothing, drop a comment. I want to hear you. I want you to understand the kind of family I came from before I tell you what they did, because if I start with the reception, you'll miss everything that made it possible and everything that made it necessary. My parents are Gerald and Miriam Whitfield. They are good people in the way that phrase sometimes gets stretched, meaning they love their children genuinely, they show up at the right moments, they remember birthdays and call on Sundays, and they are also consistently blind to the way they distribute that love. Not cruel, not calculating, just shaped by something old and unexamined, the way most families are shaped, and unwilling or unable to look at it directly. My sister Anata is 4 years younger than me. She is pretty in the way that photographs well, warm in a way that fills a room without effort, and she has always been the version of a daughter my mother pointed to when company came over. The daughter she bragged about at church, the one she called first with good news, the one she described to strangers at family gatherings as my baby, well into Renata's mid-20s. I don't say that with bitterness. I spent 2 years saying it to a therapist until I stopped needing to say it, and what I arrived at was something closer to clarity than anger. It's just the shape of how we grew up, and knowing the shape of a thing is different from being wounded by it forever. I am the other kind of daughter. The one who gets things done. The one who researches before she buys, who reads the contract before she signs, who keeps a spreadsheet for expenses the way other people keep a journal, not because I'm joyless, but because I find a particular satisfaction in accuracy. I graduated with an accounting degree from Ohio State on a merit scholarship, worked 3 years at a mid-sized firm on the east side of Columbus, and at 26 I sat for my CPA exam. I passed on the first attempt. I didn't throw a party. I took myself to dinner at a restaurant I liked, ordered the salmon, and sat with the feeling of it for an hour before driving home. By 28, I had left the firm and started taking on independent clients. It was a slow build, 1 referral, then 2, then a small business owner who told a colleague who told another. By 29, I had 11 active clients, a rented office on Marsh Avenue above a dry cleaner that smelled faintly of steam and solvent, and a savings account my parents had no idea existed. I don't talk about money. I never have. Not because I'm secretive, but because in my family, money conversations almost always turn into money opinions, and money opinions in my family almost always involve someone suggesting I should be doing something differently than I am. My mother still asks, at least twice a year, whether I'm doing okay financially, the way you might ask a college student. She means it kindly. I answer the same way every time. Yes, Mom. I've fine. I want to tell you about my great-aunt Dorothea before I tell you anything else, because she is the reason I am standing in any of this. And it was my grandfather's sister, which made her technically a great-aunt, but she had functioned as a grandmother to me in practice since I was about 7 years old, after my actual grandmother passed. She was sharp in the way that certain old women are sharp. Not sharp like a cutting remark, but sharp like a well-kept instrument, precise and purposeful and without excess. She had been a county clerk for 31 years in Franklin County. She had processed deeds, titles, estate filings, probate documents, transfer agreements, and more contracts than she could count. She understood paperwork the way some people understand music, not just technically but intuitively, as a system with its own internal logic that rewards those who learn to read it. She had very little patience for drama and a great deal of patience for detail. She was one of the only people in my family who talked to me about money as though I were a capable adult, who asked about my clients and actually listened to the answers, who treated my career as a real thing rather than an elaborate waiting room for marriage and children. When I passed my CPA exam, everyone else called to congratulate me in the way people congratulate you when they're not entirely sure what you've done. And mailed me a card. Inside was a $20 bill, which she always gave for milestones regardless of the scale, and a handwritten note on her cream stationery. It said, "Learn what you own and keep the paper. The rest is noise." I still have that card in my desk drawer, bottom left, under a box of paper clips. I've read it maybe 200 times. Aunt passed in November, 2.5 years before my sister's wedding. She was 83. She went the way she'd lived, without making a fuss, in her own house, with her affairs in order and her filing cabinet organized by year going back to 1987. Her will was 3 pages, typed, witnessed, and notarized, and among its provisions was this. Her house, a 3-bedroom bungalow in Clintonville with a large back garden and a detached garage full of neatly labeled boxes, was left to me. Not to my parents. Not split between me and Renata. To me, with a separate handwritten note attached to the will in an envelope marked with my name that said simply, "You'll know what to do." My parents were surprised. They didn't say anything critical directly. They are not, at their core, confrontational people, but I could see it in the way the conversation moved around the subject, the way my mother said "that's very" kind of in a tone that held several other sentences inside it. Renata didn't say anything to me directly, but I heard through my mother, weeks later, that she had mentioned she thought Aunt had always seemed to treat us differently. I let that one go. I was too busy learning what I owned. The house was appraised at $260,000. I put it on a 6-month rental while I figured out my plan, collected the rent, made sure the property taxes were current, and then listed it with an agent I trusted 18 months after it passed. It sold for $282,000. I paid the agent, set aside what I owed in capital gains, folded the bulk of it into an index fund I'd already been contributing to, and kept a portion liquid in a high-yield savings account. I did not tell my parents. I did not tell Renata. I did not tell anyone because none of that was anyone else's business, and because I have learned, slowly, over many years, that announcing what you have invites opinions about what you should do with it. That liquid portion. Remember it. It is the entire reason this story exists. Renata met Daniel Harrington at a sales conference in Cincinnati in late spring. She called me the same evening, which she almost never does, and talked for 40 minutes without stopping, which told me more than the words did. He was a project manager at a regional construction firm, mid-30s, good-looking in an unexceptional way, and from a family in Westchester, New York that she described as really established. I said that sounded nice. She said his mother had already texted her after their first coffee. I met Daniel 6 weeks later at a family dinner my mother organized. He was pleasant. He had good manners in the practice sense. He pulled chairs, asked follow-up questions, complimented the food twice. He remembered my name at the end of the evening, which is a lower bar than it sounds, but one that plenty of people fail. His mother, Patricia, was not at that dinner, but I heard about her through subsequent family calls in the weeks that followed. She had sent Renata a monogrammed card. She had already suggested 2 venues for a hypothetical engagement party. She had opinions, relayed through Renata, with the frequency of news bulletins, about flowers, photographers, guest list architecture, and the correct time of year for a ceremony. The engagement came 8 months after the conference. My mother called on a Thursday, crying in the good way, and I told her I was happy for them, which I was. Renata called the next day and asked if I would help coordinate the wedding. She said, "You're so good at logistics, Cass. I just want to be able to enjoy the planning without stressing about all the details." I said yes. I want you to notice the shape of that request. She didn't ask because we were particularly close. She asked because I am useful, and she knew it, and the transaction was clear to both of us even if only one of us named it that way. I said yes anyway because she was my sister, and because I had the time, and because, if I'm being completely honest, I was quietly glad to be needed for something. What followed was 14 months of work that I will not dress up as something it wasn't. It was functionally a second job. Not a fun creative project. A job with timelines and deliverables and vendor management and budget reconciliation, and the particular special challenge of managing the expectations of two families who had never previously had to agree on anything. I handled vendor research and negotiations, contract review and execution, deposit schedules, guest list logistics. The spreadsheet went through 11 versions. Catering tastings, of which there were 4, at 3 different vendors, before Renata and my mother agreed on the package they wanted. Floral design coordination across 2 rounds of revisions because Patricia Harrington felt the initial proposal skewed. 2 garden party. Table layout. A hotel room block at the Marriott near the venue that required a credit card guarantee and a minimum commitment of 40 rooms for 2 nights. Shuttle logistics for out-of-town guests. The licensing requirements for the venue we ultimately chose. That venue was the Alderton Grand Ballroom, a converted historic property on the east side of Columbus, built in 1923 as a civic auditorium and renovated in the early 2000s into an event space. It held up to 150 guests. It had 14-foot ceilings, carved plasterwork along the cornice, a polished hardwood floor, and afternoon light that came through the west-facing windows in a way that made everything inside it look like it had been waiting there to be photographed. It also had a catering partnership with a local restaurant group that had been operating in Columbus for 20 years, and an in-house event coordinator named Marcus Webb, who had been doing this work for 17 years and ran his operation with the precision of someone who understands that the difference between a good event and a disaster is almost entirely about documentation. Marcus was excellent. I want to say that clearly. He was methodical, responsive, calm under the particular pressure of brides and mothers and future mothers-in-law who changed their minds about Centerpiece Heights 11 days before the date. He communicated primarily by email, which I appreciated, and every payment confirmation he sent came with a PDF receipt, a copy of the relevant contract section, and a summary of outstanding items. He was exactly the kind of professional you want on the other side of a significant contract, because he kept records the way records should be kept, completely, accurately, and without ambiguity about who is responsible for what. Every contract went through me. My name on the signature line. My contact number as the primary. My email for all vendor correspondence. Renata was listed as the bride. Daniel was the groom. I was the contracting party, the person legally responsible for the agreements, and the person legally entitled to make decisions about them. I want to walk you through the total because I think it matters. The ballroom deposit and balance, $18,000. The catering package for 112 guests, $14,200. The floral design, across ceremony and reception, $4,800. The lighting and audio vendor, $3,500. The wedding cake, from a bakery in Bexley that Renata had wanted specifically since she saw their work at a friend's shower, $940. The rehearsal dinner venue coordination, a private room at a restaurant downtown, $2,100. The shuttle service, 2 coaches, round trip from the church to the Alderton and back to the hotel, $1,800. The bridal suite preparation, $620. The day of coordination add-on with Marcus's team for 8 hours, $980. Total, $47,940. My parents had a wedding fund they'd been building since Renata got serious with a boyfriend in her mid-20s. It contained approximately $11,000. They gave it to me to manage because I was handling the logistics. The remaining $36,940 came from my account. From the portion I had kept liquid after the house sale. From Aunt's money, which she had left to me because she trusted me to know what to do with it. My parents knew I was contributing beyond their fund. They did not know the scale. I hadn't told them because I hadn't wanted the conversation that would follow, the gratitude negotiations, the offers to pay back amounts they couldn't actually pay back, the suggestions that maybe we could find a less expensive florist. I paid what I paid because I wanted Renata to have the wedding she described to me in that first 40-minute phone call, and because I had the money, and because Aunt Dot's note said I'd know what to do with it. I thought I did. I thought that was what the money was for. The first sign that something was shifting in how the Harringtons were thinking about my place in this wedding came about 8 weeks before the date, and it arrived so reasonably packaged that I almost missed it. Patricia Harrington had a list. She always had a list of preferences, suggestions, concerns, adjustments. Most of them reached me through Renata, who relayed them with the slightly apologetic tone of someone caught between two conversations they didn't start. This particular list concerned the guest count. Patricia had 4 additional names she wanted added: 2 colleagues of her husband's from a firm in New York, and 2 family friends she described as practically family. Adding 4 guests at 8 weeks out was not a scheduling crisis, but it was a logistics problem. It meant adjusting the catering count, which triggered a change order clause in our contract. It meant revising the seating chart, which was already in its 3rd version. It meant potentially reorganizing the table configuration to accommodate the additional place settings. I ran the numbers. The catering change order came to $480. I sent the revised invoice to my mother, who forwarded it to my father, who called me and asked in his careful way whether there was any way to absorb the additional cost without a separate charge. I absorbed it. I didn't mention it again. I added it to my running spreadsheet under a column I'd labeled miscellaneous adjustments and moved on. But I noticed it. I noticed the framing of it, the assumption that adjustments originating from the Harrington side of the guest list were somehow my problem to absorb without discussion. I filed it the way I file most things that bother me: quietly, accurately, and for later. The second sign came 5 weeks before the wedding. Renata called on a Sunday evening, which she does sometimes when she's working up to something. We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular, and then she said, in the slightly sideways way she introduces uncomfortable subjects, "So Patricia saw that photo Mom posted of the family from Easter." I said I remembered the photo. She said Patricia had asked whether I was the sister who works in finance. Renata said yes. And then Patricia had said, Renata relayed this with a small laugh, as though it were amusing, that she hoped the bridal party photos wouldn't feel unbalanced. That she thought career-forward women could sometimes make a wedding feel less warm, less intimate. I held the phone very still. Something behind my eyes went flat in a way I recognize in myself when I am receiving information I need to process before I respond to it. I said, "What did you say?" Renata said she told Patricia that I wasn't actually in the bridal party, just coordinating, so it probably wouldn't be an issue. I said, "Right." She said, "You're not upset, are you?" She has a particular way of seeing things. I said I wasn't upset. I said goodbye and put my phone on the counter and stood in my kitchen for a few minutes looking out the window at the street below, where a man was walking a large tan dog that kept stopping to investigate a crack in the sidewalk. I watched the dog investigate the crack. I breathed. Then I washed the dishes I'd been letting sit and went to bed. The third sign was 3 weeks before the wedding. I received a call from the lighting vendor, a man named Troy, who ran a small AV company out of a warehouse in Groveport. He had a question about a change to the setup timeline. He'd received an email from a contact on the Harrington side asking whether the setup window could be extended by 2 hours to accommodate some additional decorative elements Patricia wanted to bring in. Troy had correctly identified that this was a contracting question, not a bride question, and had called the number on file. My number. I told him the setup window extension was possible but would require a coordination call with Marcus at the Alderton, and that any additional time would likely carry a facility fee. I called Marcus. Marcus confirmed. The extension was possible. The fee was $300. I added it to the spreadsheet. Then I called my mother, not because I needed to, but because I felt a particular tightening across my shoulders that I've learned to listen to. I told her, as evenly as I could, that the Harrington side had been making requests that were moving through informal channels and bypassing the contracting process, and that I needed everything to come through me directly, so I could manage it properly. My mother said, "Oh, Cass, you know how it is with big families. Patricia just gets enthusiastic." I said, I understood. I also said, as plainly as I could without being unkind, that enthusiastic or not, Every change that cost money needed to come to me first. My mother said she'd pass that along.
I don't know whether she did.
And then it was 11 days before the wedding. A Sunday afternoon. My father called in the morning to ask if he could stop by, which he almost never does. He's the kind of man who shows up or doesn't show up, not the kind who calls ahead, which told me immediately that he had something organized to say and wanted to say it on neutral ground. He arrived at 2. I made coffee. He sat at my kitchen table in the chair closest to the window, which is where he always sits, and he folded his hands in the way he does when he has rehearsed what comes next. He said, "I want to talk to you about the reception." I waited. He said, "The Harringtons have made a request. They've given it some thought, and so have your mother and I, and we think it's reasonable under the circumstances." He paused. "They feel that your presence at the reception might create a certain dynamic. You're successful, Cass, and that's a wonderful thing, but it can sometimes put people on edge in social situations. Make them feel like they need to measure up." Another pause. "They've asked if you might consider skipping the reception and just attending the ceremony. You could still be there for the important part." He said it the way he delivers all difficult news, without drama, as though the absence of drama makes the content more acceptable. As though calm delivery and careful content were the same thing. Asked him how long this conversation had been going on. He said, "A week or so. We wanted to be sure before we said anything."
A week.
My parents had been discussing whether to ask me to absent myself from the event I had funded for a week before mentioning it to me. I asked if Renata knew. He said, "We talked to her. She thought it was probably for the best. She didn't want to make it a thing." I sat with that. My father looked at me with the expression he wears when he believes he has delivered an unreasonable message reasonably and is hoping that will be sufficient. Something in my jaw went tight and then deliberately released. I breathed through it. I said, "Okay, Dad. I understand. I'll skip the reception." He looked relieved in the specific way of people who have been dreading a conversation and are grateful it went smoothly, without noticing that smooth is not the same as resolved. He patted the table twice. He does that, a small conclusive gesture, 2 pats, and said, "You're a good sport, Cass. I knew you'd understand." He stayed for 20 more minutes, finished his coffee, and left. I stood in my kitchen after the door closed, looking at his coffee mug on the table. My hands had gone cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I ran the tap warm and held them under it for a moment just to have something to do with them. My mother texted at 9 that evening, "Thank you for being so understanding about everything. Renata really does appreciate it. She's just not great at saying so. The Harringtons have a certain way of doing things, and I know it can feel like a lot, but this really does matter for how Daniel's family sees us going forward. You know how these things work. Love you." I read it 3 times. Then I opened my email and typed a message to Marcus Webb. I told him I had a records question about the Aldrin event on the 14th. I asked him to confirm for my files who held the primary contracting authority across all vendor agreements associated with the booking. I sent it at 9:52 p.m. He responded at 8:09 the following morning. He confirmed that my name was the sole contracting party on every document in the file. He attached a summary sheet, 1 page, 9-line items, 9 signature blocks, all bearing my name. He wrote, "Let me know if you need anything else. Happy to pull individual contracts if you need copies." I thanked him. I told him I'd be in touch about day of logistics. Then I closed my laptop and went to work. I sat with the decision for 3 full days. I want to be clear about this because I don't want you to think I acted from anger or impulse, because I didn't. I thought about it the way I think about any significant decision, carefully, honestly, with full attention to what I actually wanted versus what I was telling myself I wanted. I thought about what it would mean to simply stay home, as asked. I thought about Antot's card. I thought about 14 months. I thought about the change order fees and the setup window calls and the phrase "a certain way of doing things" and the word "sport." I thought about the fact that 112 people would stand in a room I had built and never know that I existed. On the 4th day, I called Marcus. I told him I had a situation I wanted to walk through with him. I explained, plainly, that I was the contracting party and the primary funder of the event, and that I had recently been asked not to attend the reception by the hosting family. I told him I was not interested in canceling the event. I was interested in something else. I wanted to know whether, in the normal course of his day of operations, the contracting party's identity would be part of the documentation his team worked from. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Yes. Standard procedure. The contracting party's name is on every day of file. My team references it any time there's an authorization question." I said, "And if the contracting party happened to be present, not as a guest but as a point of contact, that would be within their rights?" He said, "Absolutely. You're the contracting party. You have every right to be on site." I said, "Then I think I'll be there." He said, "I'll make sure the team knows." I thanked him and hung up. Then I called Troy at the AV company and the florist and the catering coordinator and the shuttle service. Not to cancel. Not to threaten anything. Just to confirm that if they needed to reach anyone about day of decisions, they had my number. They all said yes. They all had it. They'd had it from the beginning. The ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon at Bethany Lutheran, a small stone church 6 miles from the Alderton. I arrived at 1:45 and took a seat in the third row on the bride's side, in a dark green dress I'd worn to a client dinner the previous winter. Nobody had asked me not to come to the ceremony. I had not been disinvited from that part. I sat, and I watched my sister walk down the aisle, and I want you to know that what I felt watching her was real, not complicated by what was coming later, not filtered through grievance. She was beautiful. She was happy in a way that was visible in her entire body, not just her face, and the particular quality of that happiness, the way it made her seem lighter than usual, made something in my chest ache in a way that wasn't unpleasant. I love my sister.
I want to be clear about that.
Everything that follows exists alongside that fact, not instead of it. The ceremony ran 42 minutes. The pastor was warm and not too long. Daniel cried during the vows, which I had not expected, and I adjusted my opinion of him upward by a measurable amount. They were pronounced married at 2:46. Someone's elderly relative threw rice a half-beat early and hit the pastor, which made everyone laugh. Outside, in the parking lot, in the particular bright light of a Saturday afternoon in September, people clustered and hugged and took photographs, and the whole thing had the texture of something genuinely good happening. I drove to the Aldertons separately. I took the highway rather than surface streets because I wanted 15 minutes of quiet in the car before whatever came next. I played nothing. I drove and I looked at the road, and I let my shoulders come down from where they'd been sitting for the past 11 days. I arrived at 3:18. The lobby of the Alderton was already in motion, venue staff crossing with final arrangements, the shuttle guests beginning to arrive from the church in clusters, a few early arrivals drifting toward the coat check. The marble floor of the lobby carries sound in a particular way. Footsteps and voices arrive from unexpected directions, and everything feels slightly more resonant than it should, like being inside an instrument. Patricia Harrington was near the main entrance, standing with her husband Gerald and 2 of their adult children. She was wearing a steel blue suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and holding a small clutch that she kept adjusting in a way that suggested she was in the middle of a conversation. She was also managing externally. My mother was 3 feet away, talking to one of my father's cousins. My father was somewhere near the coat check. Renata was still upstairs in the bridal suite. I positioned myself near the far wall of the lobby, close to a column, and waited. At 3:29, Marcus Webb came through the interior doors. He walked toward the reception check-in table with the particular purposeful calm of someone who has done this enough times that confidence is just his resting state. He saw me from across the lobby. He crossed to me without changing his pace, which I respected. He said quietly, "Ms. Whitfield, I wasn't sure if you'd come in person." I said, "I wanted to make sure everything went smoothly." He nodded. He said, "We should do a quick walkthrough of the authorization protocol before the main flow starts. Do you want me to brief the team now?" I said now is fine. He turned to his coordinator, a young woman named Priya, who had been standing nearby with a clipboard and the particular focused expression of someone tracking 17 things simultaneously. He said, in the carrying, matter-of-fact voice of a man used to moving information across a busy room, Can you pull the day of contracting summary for this event? I want to make sure everyone's working from the current authorization file. Priya located the document without hesitation and handed it to him. Marcus reviewed it briefly. It was one page. I knew what it said. Then he looked up and addressed his team, for people positioned around the lobby at various points of the check-in operation, and said clearly, "Just so we're all coordinated for today, the primary contracting party for this event is Cassandra Whitfield. Any authorization questions, changes, additions, access decisions, vendor issues, go through her. That applies across all 9 vendor agreements on file." He said my name the way names appear on documents. Without inflection. Without drama. The way a fact sounds when it's just a fact. The lobby went quiet. Not dramatically. Not the silence of a held breath before something violent. The quieter kind. The silence of a room recalibrating. My mother's hand, which had been moving in some small conversational gesture, stopped. Patricia Harrington's chin moved up a fraction. Her husband Gerald turned his head toward her and said something low, and she did not respond. The early arrival guests near the check-in table had gone still in the way people go still when they sense that a conversation nearby is more important than the one they're having. Marcus handed me a copy of the summary sheet. I folded it in half and placed it in my bag. He said, "We're ready to open the main doors whenever you'd like." I said, "Give it 5 more minutes. Let people settle." He nodded and returned to his team. I did not look for reactions. I looked at the ballroom doors. They were carved wood, original to the building, and someone had polished them that morning, and they caught the late afternoon light cleanly. I thought about how good the room was going to look. I had spent 2 hours with the lighting designer 6 weeks ago, making sure of it. After a moment, I became aware that my mother was crossing the lobby toward me. She moved carefully, the way she moves when she's uncertain of what she's walking into. She stopped a few feet away. Her face was doing something I'd seen before, the expression she has when she's trying to decide which version of a response to give and hasn't landed on one yet. Her hands were clasped in front of her, which is what she does when she's not sure what to do with them. She said quietly, "Cass." I said, "Mom." She said, "I didn't know you were coming." I said, "I know." She looked at me for a moment. Something in her throat moved. She said, "The contracts." I said, "We can talk about all of it later. Not today." She held my gaze for a beat, then nodded once, slowly, and turned back toward the Harrington group. Patricia was still looking at me from across the lobby. She had the focused expression of a woman who processes uncertainty by maintaining eye contact with it. I met her gaze for 2 seconds, then looked back at the ballroom doors. Marcus called across to me, "Ms. Whitfield, whenever you're ready." I said, "Go ahead, Marcus." The doors opened. Guests began to move through. I joined the back of the crowd and walked into the room I had built. Let me tell you about the call I made to Marcus 4 days before the wedding, because it's important that you understand what I was and wasn't asking for. I had spent 3 days after my father's visit sitting with the question of what I actually wanted. Not what I was owed. I'm not interested in framing it that way, but what outcome I could live with, and what outcome I couldn't. I'm good at this kind of thinking when I make myself do it honestly. It's one of the skills that makes me useful as an accountant and occasionally exhausting as a person. I named things. I said them out loud in my apartment to the empty room, which is a habit I developed in therapy that I've maintained because it works. I said, "I am angry." I said, "I do not want to destroy my sister's wedding." I said, "I want the record to be accurate." That last one was Aunt at talking, and I knew it, and I let it be true. When I called Marcus, I told him the situation plainly. I told him I was the contracting party and the primary funder of the event, and that I had been asked by the hosting family not to attend the reception. I told him I was not calling to cancel any agreements. What I wanted to know was simple. In the normal course of his day of operations, how is the contracting party identified? Marcus said the contracting party's name was on every day of document his team worked from. Any time an authorization question arose, a vendor needed a sign-off, a guest had a request that required a decision, a change order came up on the day, his team referenced the contracting file. My name was on that file. That was just how it worked. I said I planned to be present at the venue as a point of contact. He said that was entirely within my rights. I said I wanted him to operate exactly as he normally would. I wasn't asking him to make an announcement. I wasn't asking him to stage anything. I was asking him to do his job, which included correctly identifying the person with authority to make decisions about the event. He said, I understand. I'll run it by the book. I said, that's all I'm asking. What happened in the lobby was Marcus running it by the book. He saw a gap in his team's situational awareness for staff members who might not know who to escalate to if something came up, and he corrected it. He read my name from the file, accurately because that's what the file said. The audience for that correction happened to include my mother, my father's family, and the Harringtons. That was not staging. That was geography. The validation that followed happened in layers, and each layer landed differently. The first was the lobby itself, which I've told you about. The quality of quiet that descended when Marcus said my name. The way Patricia's chin moved. My mother's stilled hand. Those reactions were not mine to produce, they happen on their own, as reactions to accurate information, and I receive them the way you receive weather. Something that is happening, not something you caused. The second layer came 40 minutes in, during the cocktail hour before dinner was seated. I had found a chair near the wall, ordered a sparkling water from a passing server, and was watching the room fill up the way you watch something you designed, with a particular satisfaction of seeing the plan match the reality. The lighting was exactly right. The florals were positioned correctly. The catering team was moving with the smooth efficiency of people who had been briefed and were executing well. Patricia Harrington came to my table without being invited, which is what she does. She doesn't ask permission. She arrives. She sat down in the chair across from me and placed her clutch on the table between us and looked at me the way she looks at things she's decided to understand. She said, I'd like to have a conversation. I said, of course. She said, the contracts. I said, what about them? She said, you're the contracting party. All of them. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. I watched her process it, not dramatically but visibly, in the small adjustments of a person recalibrating a landscape they'd misread. Her hands, which had been resting on the table, went flat and still. She said, we weren't told that. I said, no. I don't imagine you were. She said, that's a significant amount of money to be responsible for. I said, it is. Another pause. She looked at me with a directness that I found, despite everything, somewhat admirable. She said, what is it you want from today, Ms. Whitfield? I said, I want my sister to have a beautiful wedding. She held my gaze for a long moment. Something in the set of her jaw shifted, not softened exactly, but reconfigured. She said, we made assumptions that were incorrect. It was not quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement, which from Patricia Harrington I understood was equivalent. She picked up her clutch and stood and said, the room is lovely. Then she went back to her family. I sipped my water. The string quartet in the corner had moved into something I didn't recognize but found pleasant. Nearby, two of Daniel's cousins were laughing at something on a phone. The room was doing what a good room does, generating its own warmth, making people feel like staying. My father came to my table during the salad course. He sat down across from me without the folded hands posture, which told me the rehearsed version of this conversation had been abandoned. He looked tired in the particular way of people who have recently understood something they probably should have understood earlier and are sitting with the cost of it. He said, quietly, Marcus told me you're on all the contracts. I said, yes. He said, all 9. I said, all 9, Dad. He was quiet for a long moment. The table next to us broke into laughter at something, and we both glanced over and then back. He said, why didn't you tell us how much you'd put in? I said, because it would have become a conversation about the money instead of the wedding.
He thought about that.
He said, how much? I said, enough. He looked at me.
His jaw moved.
He said, Cass, and stopped. Then he tried again. What I said, about you being a good sport. He shook his head slowly. That wasn't the right thing.
I said, no.
It wasn't. He said, I'm sorry. I looked at him, my father, who is fundamentally a decent man who does not always act like it, who loves me in the incomplete way people love things they don't fully understand, who sat at my kitchen table 11 days ago and asked me to make myself smaller for people who had never done anything for me. I said, I know you are. He nodded. He put his hand on the table briefly, not quite a gesture, just a presence, and then stood and went back to his seat. I ate my salad. It was very good. The catering team had done exactly what they'd promised. The cascade didn't arrive as one moment. Real consequences rarely do. They come the way the interest on a long-neglected account comes, accruing quietly and then suddenly visible, all at once, in a number you have to sit down to look at. At the reception itself, the shift in the Harrington family's orientation toward me was visible to anyone paying attention, though most guests weren't. These things read differently to the people inside them. Gerald Harrington, Daniel's father, the quiet one, the one who had addressed me exactly once before that evening, came to my table toward the end of the dinner course. He didn't come alone. He brought Patricia, which told me the visit was organized, not spontaneous. He sat down. He said, directly and without preamble, my wife tells me you funded this event. I said, the majority of it, yes. He said, we weren't told that. Not by Renata, not by your parents. I said, I know. He said, I want to be clear that if we had known, the conversation about the reception would have gone differently. He paused. I apologize for the position you were put in. It was a formal apology, clean, direct, without excess, and I received it as such. I said I appreciated it. He nodded. He looked at Patricia, who was watching the room with the expression she wears when she's absorbing information and deciding what to do with it, and then he looked back at me and said, you do excellent work. This is a well-organized event. He said it the way you say something true that you should have said sooner. I thanked him. Patricia, before she stood to leave, said, the florist did exceptional work. She said it looking at the centerpiece on my table. Then she looked at me and said, you chose them. I said, I did. She said, good eye. And then she left. Later, during the dancing, when one of her relatives drifted over and asked how she knew me, I was near enough to hear her say, that's Cassandra. She put this evening together. Not Renata's sister. Not the one from Columbus. She put this evening together. I filed that away next to Gerald's apology and moved toward the dessert table. The harder, slower conversations happened in the days that followed, and I want to tell you about them honestly, because they are the part of the story that doesn't get told enough, the part where the aftermath arrives, not in a grand scene, but in phone calls and texts and silences that go on a beat too long. Renata called on Monday. She was in Savannah, 2 days into the honeymoon, and she called in the early afternoon, which told me she'd been thinking about it since the night before. The first thing she said was, Daniel's mother wants to send you a thank you card. Which is how Renata leads up to something. She begins with what other people want to do before she gets to what she wants to say. I waited. She said, Mom told me what happened. With Marcus. At the entrance. I said, okay. She said, you didn't have to come. I said, Marcus reads from the file. I was the contracting party. I had every right to be there. She was quiet. The silence had a texture to it. I could hear a ceiling fan or something like it in whatever hotel room she was sitting in. She said, I knew you'd put in money. I didn't know it was. I didn't realize how much. I said, no. I didn't tell you. She said, why? I said, because you didn't ask. That landed. I heard it in the pause that followed, a longer pause, a different quality of quiet. She said, Cass, I know I shouldn't have agreed to the reception thing. I said, no, you shouldn't have. She said, Dad made it sound so reasonable. And Patricia had been making these comments, and Daniel was stressed, and I thought if I could just get through the day without a conflict. I said, I understand that. She said, but it wasn't right. I said, no. Another long pause. I heard her exhale. She said, I'm sorry. I mean it. I believed her. Renata's apologies are always fair, which means they're usually genuine. She doesn't dress them up, and she doesn't take them back. I said, I know you do. She said, Can we do better? Going forward. I thought about this carefully before I answered, because I wanted to say something true rather than something easy. I said, Yes, I think we can. But it'll require you to actually notice me sometimes. Not just when you need the logistics handled. She said quietly, Yeah, I know. I said, Okay then. She said, Okay. We talked for another 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The hotel, the weather in Savannah, the fact that she'd eaten shrimp and grits for the first time and found them life-changing. It was the most normal conversation we'd had in months. I hung up and stood in my kitchen and felt something that wasn't quite happiness and wasn't quite sadness, the specific feeling of a thing that has been wrong for a long time beginning, maybe to move. My mother called 3 times before I picked up. On the 4th call, Tuesday evening, I answered. She had prepared what she wanted to say, which is her way. She organizes her thoughts in advance, which means the conversation is always about what she planned rather than what's actually present. She said she was sorry for how things had been handled. She said the Harringtons had been more demanding than she'd anticipated. She said she hoped I knew how much they valued me. She said she understood that what she'd asked, what she'd allowed my father to ask, hadn't been fair. I let her get through it. Then I said, I appreciate that, Mom. She said, We're going to pay you back. Whatever you spent over time, well, your father and I talked about it, and I said, Keep the 11,000. That was yours. Consider the rest my wedding gift to Renata. She went quiet in a way that sounded like she might cry. She said, Cass, that's too much. I said, It's done. I've already reconciled it. She said, Why do you always? And then stopped. I said, Why do I always what? She said quietly, You make it so hard to help you. I thought about that for a moment. I said, I think maybe the issue is that helping me has usually meant being included. And being included has been the hard part. A long silence. She said, Yes, I think that's right. Her voice was different, lower, slower, more honest than her prepared version had been. She said, I'm going to do better, Cass. I want to do better. I said, I'd like that. I meant it. I don't know yet what it looks like in practice. These things unfold slowly, in the ordinary time of phone calls and Sunday dinners, and the small choices that either accumulate into something or don't. But I meant it. Patricia Harrington sent a handwritten card on cream stationery, which arrived 8 days after the wedding. It said, Cassandra, what you built for Renata and Daniel was extraordinary. We should have known the full picture from the beginning. I hope we have the chance to do better.
Patricia H.
I put it in the same drawer as Antot's card. They sit next to each other now, the 20-year-old note and the new one, and I find something in that arrangement that I can't quite name, but don't need to. Gerald Harrington sent a separate email asking if I took individual clients for tax planning and estate work. He said Patricia had mentioned I was a CPA and that they'd been looking for someone new since their last advisor retired. I wrote back that I had one open slot. I sent him my rates, which are fair and not negotiable. He replied within the hour and said they'd like to proceed. I scheduled the intake call for the following Thursday. I added it to my calendar. Then I opened my spreadsheet and began the year-end reconciliation I'd been putting off for a week. I've thought about what the lesson is here, and I don't think it's what people expect me to say. It's not that I won. I don't think of it that way. The room was full of people who didn't know my name until a coordinator read it from a sheet of paper, and after that they did. And the difference between those two states is not victory, it's accuracy. The record was corrected. The thing that was true became visible. Aunt spent 31 years making sure records were accurate. She understood that the paper doesn't lie and doesn't perform and doesn't need to be dramatic about being right. It just says what it says, and eventually the people in the room have to reckon with it. I am my great-aunt's student in every way that matters. Learn what you own and keep the paper. The rest eventually is noise. That's my story. A kitchen table, a contracting summary sheet, and a venue manager who reads from the file. Before I go, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been the person who made the thing happen, who organized it, funded it, held the pieces together when they were falling apart, and then been quietly asked to step back so someone else could stand in the light without the awkward context of your involvement? Maybe it was a family event. Maybe it was a project at work. Maybe it was something smaller that still cost you something you didn't get back. I want to know, what did you do? Did you say something? Did you let it go? Did you find a way to let the record speak for itself? Drop your answer in the comments. I genuinely want to hear it.